Welcome to Peeling Syd Barrett. This will be episode 31. And in this episode, I'd like to discuss four songs. Those songs are Dominoes, She Took a Long Cold Look at Me, Wined and Dined, and It Is Obvious. Now, these four songs are somewhat related in that they have a really kind of a slow, kind of a melancholic feel as romantic kind of love songs. And so I wanted to do all four of them together. There's no way of knowing really, who exactly these songs are about, but I do feel like there's a certain connection between the four of them in that the general sentiment appears to be a kind of a realization or perhaps a desire for a certain type of relationship that perhaps can't be attained or perhaps is lost. So we'll go through those in just a minute, and what I'd like to do in the beginning of this episode, like normal, is to go through and mention a few things. One of them is that we do have a number of new subscribers, and if you've recently subscribed, I do thank you for that. I don't like to call people out unless they make comments or have questions or notice mistakes that I've made, and if they kind of mention that they are okay with me posting their names, because not everybody likes to have their names posted in a video. Some people are fine with it and some aren't. So if you're okay with it, then let me know. And if I'm not sure, or if you make a note of something and you don't want your name attached to it, then just go ahead and note that, and I won't. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is I'd like to discuss a few corrections or perhaps clarifications of two things. One of them is Jose Lamsfus, who's a normal contributor and goes in and comments quite frequently, noted that there is an old kind of a children's rhyme that's called out in the book 1984. Now, in our last episode, we were discussing Orwell and the nature of, I guess you could say, the Orwellian fear of the future that's tied to a kind of dystopian, absolutist, technological dictatorships. And that is all encompassed in his book 1984, or at least how he kind of envisioned that would be. And there is a children's rhyme in there called Oranges and Lemons. And I think this may be an actual children's rhyme in England. Again, I'm not English, so I'm not familiar with this oranges and lemons rhyme. But in the book, they can't quite recall this rhyme. And I guess you could say that, in a way, it kind of is a warning that the simple, hopeful sentiments of childhood would be lost in that type of a society is the reason why Orwell is calling it out. And you'd have to say that certainly does seem reasonable. So I did not make a connection between Orwell and the song Apples and Oranges, and we did a breakdown of Apples and Oranges before. And perhaps that was an oversight, and perhaps there's no connection. Apples and Oranges as a song doesn't feel like a political song. It feels like a relationship song. There is mention of a marketplace and being able to buy everything she wants in a supermarket store. So I don't know, there may be something going on there, but I don't really sense that Apples and Oranges is a political song, though it certainly could be. That's the first correction. The second one is that Sifa posted that the song Gigolo Aunt, or Gigolo Aunt, which we also just discussed in the last episode, could simply be a reference to a kind of a female form of a gigolo. In other words, this is the 60s, of course, and we have a redefinition of not only female roles but male roles, a redefinition of husband-wife roles, a redefinition of female-male. We have redefinitions of father-son, father-daughter, mother-daughter, mother-son. All these relationships were undergoing a kind of a review at that point in time, and a lot of it is tied to, of course, liberation and empowerment of people. And I think it would be remiss to say that, that it isn't possible that this title Gigolo Aunt isn't simply perhaps a woman that's kind of a caretaker or an aunt, perhaps older, that's behaving like a gigolo. And that's kind of what I believe what Sifu was trying to relay. That certainly is possible. Now, when I called out my two possibilities for that song, one is that this would be perhaps a form of a female gigolo that is behaving as a plant, a garden plant, and gigolo ant. We discussed the Cockney rhyming slang possibility, and that in that case it might be because of the GA abbreviation for the words. It could be a reference to a government agent, a GA, which is similar to Bob Dylan's Subterranean Blues, the second verse of Bob Dylan's Subterranean Blues. Now, the second possibility that I called out was that the gigolo aunt, an aunt, was also slang for a male homosexual, and there may be that aspect to it. And I don't know necessarily that that's kind of what's going on. In the song, there do appear to be two different people being referenced, that there is a gigolo aunt, but there's also a satin in tow, and the satin may be someone else, so there may be two references that are happening in that song, or two references to two different people that are happening in that song. I don't know, but the gigolo aunt does seem to be kind of dismissive and judgmental, and I don't want to ignore the possibilities that, as we've mentioned before, that Mr. Barrett may have had a fluid sexuality. He may have been bisexual or LGBTQ. There's no way of knowing something like that, and there are various reasons to think that. We've kind of discussed those things. I don't think it's fair to ignore them, because I don't think that would be fair to the community of LGBTQ people. They've been dismissed and mistreated for a very long time, not just by our own society, but they continue to be by many societies. So people like Oscar Wilde, of course, were very poorly treated, and a lot of people have been unjustifiably sent to psychiatric care for simply being a member of that community. And it's a little bit extreme when you realize that there are people committing murder and stealing and doing these things, and LGBTQ people are simply trying to live lives. And so long as a person is a contributing member of society, it's very, very difficult to understand why so many people want to give them a hard time. Basically, I don't really get it personally. And again, I'm not a member of that community, but I certainly do recognize that they've been mistreated for a very long time. So I just want to note that. Now, there are different references within quite a few of Mr. Barrett's work. We discussed Arnold Layne and the line Doors Bang Chain Gang, of course, in his song about a man that is apparently wearing women's clothing, could very easily be a reference to the LGBTQ community, and also a reference to the injustice of locking someone up just because they like wearing women's clothing as a man. It does seem to be somewhat unfair. And of course, Mr. Barrett in that song Arnold Layne asked the question, why can't you see? Oh, why can't you see what? Well, there's no way of knowing exactly what he means there, but we have to recognize again that this is the 60s, and it was still not considered acceptable by general society for people to be part of that community. So he would not be able to come out and say something like that at that time. Now, there is an interview, and it's History of Pink Floyd, I believe HD Pink Floyd, and within the first 5 to 10 minutes of that, it's not an interview, sorry, it's a documentary. Mr. Waters does relay a story about Mr. Barrett getting in a car in a frock and declaring that he's kind of a homosexual. And people are, and he's quite dismissive, as in like, what are you talking about? You're not, you have girlfriends and all this other stuff. But I just want to point out that something like that, again, is not knowable. Of course, Mr. Barrett had kind of a sense of humor, so maybe he was making a joke. I don't know. There's no way of knowing something like this, of course, because Mr. Barrett never explains these things, so we really don't know what to make of some of these stories, or at least I don't know what to make of some of the stories. I will relay one more story, though, and that is the long interview, and I'll link both of these. I'll link the history, and I'll link the interview with Mr. Roger Waters, where he details meeting with REM and Michael Stipe back backstage after an REM concert, and he apparently really liked REM for a while. And apparently Michael Stipe was kind of giving him the cold shoulder, and then went out and did a, a version of Dark Globe, which may be a jibe or a poke at Roger Waters. Don't know. And as you can probably tell from this series that we put together, in my opinion, I don't think that it's knowable really what the relationship between Roger Waters and Syd Barrett is. A lot of people think Syd Barrett was kind of kicked out. Perhaps they had a falling out. It's hard to know. Roger Waters did have kind of a falling out with a number of members of the band, so it certainly is possible. But what's the Michael Stipe angle? And I'll give you one possibility, and I don't know that this is true, but I'll give you one possibility. Michael Stipe, for a very long time, did not want to address his own sexuality. He wanted to concentrate on his work, and he wanted to concentrate on the art form itself. And he would not discuss his own sexuality. And he thought it would be distracting to do so. He did finally come out as a gay man. And I just want to point out that if Mr. Stipe thought that the band had removed Mr. Barrett because he may have had LGBTQ tendencies, or if he was gay, or something else was happening, he may have been quite offended by that. And I think that's totally understandable if he knew something. Now, I don't know anything, so I can't really say that I know what's happening there. But it is interesting to me that Mr. Waters gives that story, and if you consider the possible reasons why Michael Stipe may be giving him the cold shoulder when apparently they had never met before, there's only so many reasons why someone would do that with someone that they didn't know, and then they would go out and sing a song like Dark Globe. And that obviously is a connection to Mr. Barrett. So that's one possibility that would explain that story in my mind. So at any rate, let's go ahead then, and we'll discuss the 4 songs. And let me get my book of lyrics. Where did I put my book of lyrics? So we'll start with Dominoes, and Dominoes was the 3rd track on the Barrett album, released in November of '70. So the Madcap Laughs and the Barrett album both were released in 1970. Quite interestingly, I might add. That's a very fast turnaround on putting together 2 albums, in my opinion. But Pink Floyd, as a group, were very good at putting out a lot of work very fast. So let's look at Dominoes, which is this kind of slow, languid, kind of a story, I guess, a story song. And it has a feel to it much like Terrapin, of kind of slow rolling music that's dreamy, or perhaps underwater, as Mr. Barrett likes to discuss, or metaphor. And we'll see what we get. Now, I will point out that we discussed in Did Syd Barrett Led Zeppelin 4 the possibility of the backwards guitar. I won't explain that too much here because I've already discussed that in the Did Syd Led Zeppelin 4. If you're interested in the guitar portion of that and what the implications of that might be, you can watch that episode. At any rate, let's look at these lyrics here. There's mention that there's an idea that someday in tears and in dreams. So right there, there's no literal translation of that. I just want to point that out. He's not saying anything, really, although you do get the sensation of understanding kind of what's being relayed. So what's being relayed? Perhaps the hopes and fears that someday something will happen, and that they're being recognized through tears and in dreams. So what would that be? The next line gives us a hint. There's a mention that it's a rhetorical question, perhaps, about seeing her prove something. What does she need to prove? I don't know. Who is she? It's not clear. But there definitely is a her and a hope, perhaps, because of tears and dreams, that she'll be able to prove something. What is she going to prove? Well, the next line kind of gives us a hint that life will come of no harm. Or in other words, there won't be any hurt in life. And perhaps this gives us an explanation then of what Mr. Barrett is hoping to see out of someone before he's willing to fully commit to them, which is that they will not be someone that will hurt him. And that's understandable given his past with his father dying and his previous relationships going poorly. And of course, the possibility that he may have had some form of a contentious relationship with his own mother, and that's been addressed in various songs already, as we discussed, including Matilda Mother. The next bit goes you and I and dominoes, etc., and the day goes by. So they're just kind of playing dominoes and letting the time go by. The next verse mentions that you and I are in place, again wasting time with dominoes. It's mentioned that the day is dark and warm, and that again there will be no harm in life, and it repeats the line dominoes and the time goes by. So it's just kind of this slow, languid, spending time together with someone, and perhaps not saying a whole lot, but just playing dominoes. Okay, the next verse mentions fireworks and heat, and of course fireworks reminds me of the idea of being in arguments, etc. We've discussed that possibility with a song like, I believe it was Dark Globe, where he mentions waving sticks, coffee brands all around. So fireworks and heat. So heat in this case could be arguments someday. Gold a shell. I don't know what that could possibly mean. What gold a shell is. Now we just went through a song that mentioned something shell, something water shell male. So here again is a gold a shell. So now we know that song, water shell male, which could have been from Gigolo Aunt, could be a self-reference. Is very likely a self-reference. I mentioned there a stick or play. Now that stick reference right there throws me off. A stick or play, and the reason that's throwing me off is because I just got done doing Did Syd Metal, and one of the lyrics to Saint-Tropez mentions breaking a stick in the ground or something like that. I'll put the lyric here up on the screen, but at that time I said, I don't really get it. It's a very simple verse, which kind of makes sense for Mr. Waters, but here then is the use of stick again. What that could possibly mean, I don't know, but it's a reference to a stick or play again. Now Metal as an album came out much later than this album, so here's the stick reference that predates the reference in Saint-Tropez. Okay, overhearing a lark today. A lark, of course, is in English poetry a representation of the poet himself. So perhaps a recognition of reflection is stated by this overhearing a lark. Mentioned that they're losing when their minds astray. Again, there are far-flung thoughts that are specified there, and the idea that they're losing at dominoes because they are not able to really pay attention to the dominoes. What could possibly be leading this person's mind astray? Here this person is with someone playing dominoes, and yet they're not focused on that person, which you would expect if they're in a relationship that is totally focused on another person. If they're with the ideal person, you would think that they would be entirely focused on that person. There are only so many reasons, of course, why they wouldn't be. One possibility is, of course, this isn't the person that they're fixating on as a romantic interest. The second possibility I just want to point out is they could be torn between different ideas. So if someone, for example, is like Albert Einstein and is married or in a marriage and is also constantly considering the nature of physics, and you can read about Albert Einstein if you like, but he didn't really treat his wife as a romantic partner. He was very unromantic to his wife, and I guess you could say he treated her more like a maid than he did what most people would consider to be kind of a balanced romantic relationship style of arrangement. So he would do things like always wear the same types of clothes, and she would take care of everything in the house because he didn't want to be bothered with thinking with those things. So what is Mr. Barrett actually thinking about here? I just want to point out the possibility, of course, that his statement here that his mind is astray could be a reference to it being astray about other considerations, perhaps music, perhaps art, perhaps things he was working on, things he wanted to work on, visions of the future, It could be religious references. It could be pretty much anything. But I just want to point out that if you are together with your ideal person, your mind won't be astray um, if if you are totally focused on that person. He mentions next that don't you want to know something and that they have pretty hair. There's a mention again of stretching out your hand. The hand reference is consistent with Mr. Barrett's poetry and writing. He talks about hands being tall or hiding hands. It seems to be something that he quite often references. There's a reference to glad fields. We've already discussed the nature of what fields could be represented by, as in green fields, glad fields, fertile fields. All those things are, of course, possible sexual metaphors. And a mention of echoes in your way. We just discussed and did Syd Barrett Metal, the song Echoes, and the possibility or the relationship between waves and echoes as a metaphor for memories and relationships that permeates that album. And of course, here is a mention of echoing for your way. And then just kind of repeats some of the similar ideas that were presented before. So all in all, I mean, it's a very consistent form of song to Mr. Barrett's previous writing, and you can make a lot of connections to other songs. Okay, so the next song that I would like to discuss is She Took a Long Cool Look at Me, which is, I guess you could say, a little bit of a judgmental song. So let's go ahead then and take a look at that. So she took a long, he mentions that she took a long cold look at me, which is a little bit, I'm not sure what to make of the most important adjective there, which is cool. He mentions that she smiles and then gazed over his arm. Here again is a possible reference to arms, and of course the possible reference to drugs and particular opiate use. That's confirmed with the next line, that she likes to see him get down to ground, which perhaps is a reference that, of course, this is a drug abusing relationship. And then mentioned that she doesn't have time to be with him. I don't totally get the connection between that and the previous. Of course, getting down to ground also could just be she likes to see him get depressed because she doesn't have time to be with him, which is kind of a strange relationship, in my opinion. Okay, the next verse kind of discusses that there's a face that's between she means to be, and then a repeat of extreme, to be extreme. What that could mean, I don't know, but I do want to say that, of course, a face is a psychological term that's often kind of used to denote a personality that's being presented that is not a true person, or is not a true representation of a person. So she may be presenting a face to him or to other people. Why extreme? I don't know. I don't understand the extreme reference. The idea of a broken pier on a wavy sea kind of denotes that there's trouble. And of course, a pier is a connection between two lands. And then she's wondering why she wants to see. I don't, honestly, I can't understand that line. So he gets up and stomps around and then hits a place where the trees touch the ground. There's again a around and ground, that kind of alliteration that is consistent. You can trace that all the way back to Astronomy Domine and what's going on there, but it appears that they're having, this is a reference to some kind of a disagreement or an argument, and that Mr. Barrett is acting out physically in some way. The next verse says that there's an end of truth that lays out the time, and he's kind of lazing there in a painting green, a mile or more in a foreign clime, to see farther inside of himself, or farther inside of me. What all that could mean, I don't know. Again, this doesn't literally make sense. You have to kind of feel what it could possibly mean, which makes it, in my opinion, it makes it wonderful abstract poetry. But it does give the feeling that perhaps that there is some kind of end of truth or an end of an ideal, and why there would be a painting green, I don't know. But again, we just mentioned glad fields, and there have been reference to fertile green fields before, so perhaps a painting green, and by painting, perhaps he means a period of time, that this green period of time that he has been lazing on is kind of ending, and it has something to do with a foreign clime. Um, why that would be, I don't know. Perhaps there was a trip or something. And then finally, it ends with looking high into the sky and breathing. There's a reference there to breathing. As water streams over me. Now, what that water that's streaming over him would be, it's hard to say. Could be echoes, could be memories. So perhaps Mr. Barrett is poetically linking the ideas of water and memory, as many people do. Many people denote the connection between water and dreams because of the strange kind of floating, somewhat disconnected to this world sensation that people have. So perhaps he's remembering, or perhaps he's dreaming, and he's having the water stream over him. Or, of course, it could be that he's looking up into the sky and crying, and that his tears are forming water that's streaming over him. All right, let's move on then to the next song I would like to discuss, which is Wined and Dined. Now, this was the 9th track on the Barrett album, and that was released in November of 1970. So here again is a reference to a relationship, Wined and Dined, and he mentions that it seemed like a dream. So there's another dream reference. There was a girl that was so kind, and it was a kind of love that he hadn't seen before. And he mentions that it was just last summer, and it wasn't so long ago, but now the musk winds blow. So here's a reference to winds blowing. There are numerous references to winds blowing within James Joyce's poetry and chamber music. He's constantly referencing wind blowing. So there's another poetic reference, much like the lark, that is a traditional poetic reference to change. Why that musk would be, I don't know. Perhaps it has something to do with rotting or old relationship. So although this all just happened just last summer, now there's a sense of decay in the relationship, and so there is a change in the wind that's blowing. And it just kind of repeats from there until it gets to a mention that chalk is underfoot. And again, here's the sensation, life I should prove. So here's again this statement that there's this kind of relationship where apparently people are expected to constantly or in some way prove that they are someone or something. Again, here's a mention that they're dancing in heat. So there's another reference to heat that's consistent with the songs that we just discussed, and relaying that to the idea of being in love or being in arguments. And then the rest of it just kind of repeats. So a very simple song, but repeating sentiments and themes that were discussed before. Now, the last song that I would like to discuss is It Is Obvious. This is the 4th track off of the Barrett album. This is another kind of this languishing love song. It's quite a complicated song, and there are a lot of references in here that I'm not going to be able to explain, but let's give it a try and see what we get. So he starts out with It Is Obvious, and he says, can you say, baby, that something is on another plane? What would be found on another plane, I don't know, but perhaps it's just a sentiment or an idealized relationship that's being specified as watery or dreamy in some way. Perhaps Mr. Barrett, like Mr. Morrison, was constantly chasing a muse or an ideal, and maybe he was never able to completely find it. It's hard to say. The next line is a little bit interesting. He says he can creep into cupboards or sleep in the hall. And the reason that's interesting, of course, is because that sounds very similar to Julia Dream. And in Julia Dream is the mention that the scaly armadillo might find me where I'm hiding. So this has the same feel to it of Julia Dream and hiding. The next bit mentions that there are stars that are yours and there are stars that are mine. Again, the star reference is consistent with Mr. Barrett and also is mentioned in songs like Terrapin. He mentions the stars are simple cot bars. What is a cot bar? I have no idea what a cot bar is. There's a mention that something is only an impulse and it's pie in the sky. Now there's a word combination here: mumble, listen, dolly. What that could mean, I don't know. Of course, we just discussed Dolly Rocker, so I don't know. Perhaps there's some meaning in that, and what that could be, I don't know. Why he would combine those words, I don't know. There is alliteration on the L consonant, but other than that, I don't understand that, and I don't think anyone can. That's something that either is just a word combination that was interesting, or it means something so specific to Mr. Barrett that it will be incredibly difficult to understand. He mentions drifting over your mind. There again is drifting, which is a water reference, of course, and it's tied to the mind. So here's another echoes, water, memory, kind of combination form of reference that is consistent with his work. A reference to holly. I don't know why he would be referencing holly. I believe holly is tied to Christmas time, so perhaps loving in the winter, perhaps that's a reference to loving. I don't know. I'll put up some possible reasons why holly might be used here on the screen when I put this together, but just off the top of my head, I don't know why he would be mentioning holly other than it rhymes with dolly. I'm sure there's more to it than that, given Mr. Barrett's tendencies. Okay, he mentions creeping into a bed when someone's head is on the ground, which could, of course, mean that that person also is partaking in drugs, and in particular, the implication could be opiates. So he may be in a relationship with someone who is an addict, and so he's creeping into bed. And here is the restatement in the next few lines of holding a torch on a porch and winking an eye. In other words, sending a message by having a light out, which is the same as Julia Dream. It's been referenced, I can say perhaps two times previous to this, but just off the top of my head, of course, that's mentioned in Julia Dream. The next verse kind of starts with something being written on the brambles. Why it would be written on the brambles, I don't know. It's stranded on spikes. A mention of his blood being red. So there's the color red again, and the direct tie to blood, which we've discussed thoroughly in a number of episodes. And he says, can't you remember the times? And you could call, and then you'd be there. In other words, he could make a call, and someone would be there. And of course, we just mentioned the idea of yelling through the skies, or sending a message through the skies. And of course, that could simply be a metaphor for a telephone or a telephone call. And perhaps that's what's being here. It's a poetic reference of some kind to the nature of calling through the air. And that's been mentioned a couple of times. And I'll kind of put those references up here. And I believe Jose Lamps was kind of mentioned this before. And there might be one that was tied to, I don't want to guess for sure, but I think it was on Matilda Mother. So I'll indicate the previous references here on the screen. Now there's a mention that there's being braver and being a handkerchief waver. So a handkerchief obviously is something that you cry into. Louder lips and a loud hailer. I don't know why someone would be a loud hailer. Of course, we just had a reference to being brave and waving a handkerchief and being a good hailer. So perhaps a hailer with a handkerchief. I don't know. The next line states that they're growing and gathering for the good of each other. A mention of wandering, stumbling, fumbling, rumbling, and then their minds are shot together, minds shot together. So this wandering, stumbling, fumbling, rumbling kind of combination of words appears to be kind of what you would expect from a pair of young lovers that are trying to find their way through a relationship and are unable to do so. Thus, the wandering, trying to find their way, the stumbling, having problems with the relationship, fumbling, very similar, and rumbling, which would be the arguments and fighting. And then the statement that their minds are shot together, and perhaps that would be an indication of simultaneous drug use. It could just be falling in love, having their minds shot together with love. Certainly a possibility. I don't want to state that I know that that's a drug reference, of course, but as we mentioned before, the previous references to sneaking into bed, etc., seems to be an indicator of mutual drug abuse as a possibility. Okay, so the last verse mentions that there's equally over a valley, there's a hill wood, a quarry stood, and both of them are crying. And this appears to be a very specific memory, and although the rest of this is kind of a general statement of a relationship, this to me appears to be recalling a very specific memory of being in a quarry and crying together in a velvet curtain of gray. What would be a velvet curtain of gray? I don't know. Perhaps fog. Perhaps there's some kind of a connection between the words velvet and fog and gray. Perhaps it's raining. There's Mark, the blanket where sparrows play. Now, Mark there could be remember. Remember the blanket where the sparrows were playing, and the trees waving, and the corn was stranded. And then his legs moving the last inches, so getting closer. And the warmth and the weather, everything seems to be in a suspense. Mention of Mog to a Grog. I do not understand that at all. I know there's a Gog Magog or something like that that's supposedly tied to England somehow, but Mog to a Grog, I don't know. That's perhaps a literature reference that I'm not familiar with. I'll try and look it up, and then I'll put something on the screen if I can find anything. A star of white chalk, and then their minds are shot together, their minds are shot together. The star in white chalk, I don't know. That could perhaps be I don't know, it could be a magic reference even. I don't know if that's something that's happening there. Why that would be made there, I don't know. Perhaps this is, I know there's white chalk at Dover, so perhaps, and that's kind of by the sea, but he does mention being in a quarry in white chalk, so perhaps there's a connection between, again, there could just be that they saw a star and there's white chalk around because they're in a quarry kind of an area. So that kind of sums up those four songs, and I think you can see that there's a lot of similarity in them. I don't know necessarily that that those are real songs. Again, they could just be songs that were just songs that Mr. Barrett made up. They could be very direct songs about very direct memories with very specific relationships, and those relationships might not even be the same people. He never defines people by name directly, to my knowledge. I can't think of any examples anyway. So even when he does refer to people, he usually uses a kind of a pseudonym to refer to them. So it's hard to know exactly who he's speaking about there, but the sentiment seems to be quite similar. And we do have to wonder, of course, why Mr. Barrett would have these romantic relationships and perhaps never really attain a family life. It's totally possible. We have to consider the possibility that he didn't want one. He may have just wanted to have a series of romantic relationships, and perhaps that's following a muse of some kind. Now, for context, I want to kind of talk about two things, and they aren't from the past. They're from kind of the present. The first is that I will link a kind of a story about a song by Radiohead, and that song is called How to Disappear Completely. And this song is a wonderful song, and it reminds me quite a bit of Mr. Barrett, and apparently it ties in with the ideas of stress and being responsible for developing music and Radiohead and the singer of the band kind of trying to discuss how to deal with that. Now, there's another Michael Stipe story that's tied with this, and I will give the video that I watched on here if you want to watch it. But I want to point out that there's a number of things in this song that do remind me a lot of Mr. Barrett and perhaps could explain his mindset. There's a certain feel in the very first few lines of Alienation saying that that's not me and that they can travel through walls, etc. So perhaps spiritual movement. There's a reference to floating down the Liffey or floating down the river. That's consistent with Mr. Barrett. Poetically, he's quite often mentioning streams, rivers, floating, Ophelia, etc. Excuse me, and not being here, and this kind of isn't happening. And there's a story behind all this that ties in with Michael Stipe. If you want to watch it, you can. But this song specifically is a song that is mentioned to be a favorite song, and I guess if you enjoy Mr. Barrett, perhaps you'll enjoy this song. Now, the second song that I want to call out is a song by Michael Kiwanuka. And the reason for that is that we don't have a whole lot of Mr. Barrett's music actually where he's just kind of grooving on guitar. So unfortunately, I think we don't have a very accurate kind of a feel for what he was doing with Pink Floyd. This song that Michael Kiwanuka put together, to me, sounds a lot like what Pink Floyd kind of became, and also has him on a slide guitar making some really kind of, I don't know, it's a bit similar to David Gilmour, but it feels a little more like Syd. So if you're interested and you think, well, you know what, maybe the band might have sounded like if Mr. Barrett had stayed in the band, or what they might have sounded like in concert in some way, this song, to me, it feels a lot like what perhaps they might have been. So I'll give a link there and I'll give the information. At any rate, that's pretty much it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope it had some information that, or ideas in it that maybe gave you some things to think about, and I will talk to you later.